Thank you all very much, and I want to thank Sister Janet and Sister Bertha and for the decorations that you see around here. And Brother Epperson was here, and Ben was. I drug him down from the deal, but yeah, if you we're probably going to. Some of these are on their last leg, so we may be changing some more, buying some more next year. Getting some different ones. I know we're trying to clean up, but some of them are kind of falling apart and different things like that. But it does look really good right now. And so I appreciate everybody coming out and helping us Wednesday night so when we got it ready. Anything else before I get my little note started here? Well, I thought I'd talk a little bit. It's been, Brother Epperson doesn't ever hardly talk on this because it's his salary, okay? I'm going to be talking about biblical giving. And a lot of pastors have a hard time with this because it sounds like they're doing it for their own benefit. And it's really not, okay? The offerings that we take, the tithes and the offerings, go to our pastors for certain reasons. And it's because they're doing God's will, and we'll get into that in just a second. But we, many times when we give to somebody maybe not here at our local church, or given to an organization or whatever, once we give it, it's gone. We can't, take it back. And if they do something with it that we don't like, well, don't give to them anymore, I guess, if that's the way. I'm just saying, you got to do what the Lord tells you to do. But sometimes they misuse it. Things come out, then you have to readjust your changing. But for the most part, the ministry is what is represented here. The systems of tithes and offerings was intended to impress upon the minds of men a great truth that God is the source of every blessing to his creatures, and that to man's gratitude, that to him man's gratitude is due for the good gifts of his providence. How many of you ever thought of that? It's all God's. He gives us things. Now, I know we work for it, but he gives us the ability to work. We was talking a little bit this morning about the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve. They still had to work. He put them in the garden to tend it. We were intended to do work, to do things. Now, because of the sin, we have to work a little harder, or maybe a lot harder than what we originally did. But we are, and when we're compensated for that, through our salaries or whatever we get, then we are to give back to God. And his first part, or his tenth, is the first part off the top. A couple of things in Acts 17:25, it says, he giveth to all life and breath and all things. So he gives everything to everybody. He's made everything, and he gives it to us to use. In Psalms 50:10, it says, every beast of the forest is mine, and the cattle upon 1,000 hills. I know we always talk about that, or hear about it. The cattle, all the cattle of the earth is God's. Everything is God's, no matter what it is. And because of that, he gives it unto us, and we're to manage it. That's what we do here on earth. We get it, and we're to manage what he gives us through both tithes and offerings, okay? Now, two types of giving in the Bible. There's required giving, and that's going to be the tithe. And then there's free will offerings. And that comes about through several ways. And this was taught even in the very beginning, or one of the earliest parts of the chapters. We're going to go back to the New Testament, the Old Testament, and then that builds a foundation, and the New Testament just kind of keeps on going from there. Tithing was to the Levites, or the priests in the Old Testament, to the ministry, or to the ministry in the New Testament. This was to support the office of priest or today's ministers. Tithing was also used to assist during sacred meals. Whenever they would have a meal in Jerusalem or a big convocation, and we'll read in just a minute, says, bring a tithe to help pay for all this. And that's kind of today. We do similar things. The word tithe, and to us, it's what we think it is. It's actually, the meaning is a tenth. The Hebrew word means a tenth. Another word in Nehemiah for tithe is aser, which is, the Hebrew word was maser, and in one part. In Nehemiah, it's aser, which means to take or give a tenth. So this is where we get a tenth, and understand that it's a tenth or 10% of whatever we get is what we give back to God for his allowing us to use what he's given us. Genesis 14 and 20 is the first time that we hear about the tithe mentioned in the Bible. This is, of course, when Abraham had gone out and defeated the king. They'd taken Lot and a lot of his family and servants and everything, and Abraham got his people together, his servants and everything, and they went out and fought and brought them back. And when he brought them back, a king met him, and it called a king of Salem, which today we know as Jerusalem. That king was Melchizedek. And he wrote, "And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And that was Melchizedek saying. And then it says, and it talks about, this is Abraham, and he gave him a tithe of all. Melchizedek was the first priest. It goes back, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in Hebrews in the New Testament, but he's the first priest that we understood that's mentioned in the Bible. And Abraham insists on giving him 10% of what he's gathered from the armies and from winning the war, the battles that's come up. A little bit later on, Jacob was in his dream of the ladder when he was resting that night on a stone. And in Genesis 28 and 22, says, "And this stone which I have set for a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that thou shalt give me, I will surely give the 10th unto thee." So Jacob had a vision. He had sent his family on ahead, and he was laying down to sleep. And in that vision, he saw the angels going up and down the ladder, and he saw the glory of heaven. And by this, he was so moved that they saw that he needed to give what was going to be given to him, give it back to God. And he calls it the 10th. Now there's several, I guess we call it tithes, but there's several places in the Old Testament it mentions tithes. I'm not quite sure if they're all the same. At one time I thought they were different. They may be different or they may be the same. A couple of them are different, we'll see as we go through here. But it's still the tithe. We talked about the Levites were the chosen ones. As we've been studying in our Wednesday night Bible study, Levi was one of the 12, of the ancients. Judah and all the different, his brothers, Joseph, all those in there. Levi was one of those. Of Levi, underneath him, a couple of generations, was Aaron, and his brother Moses and Miriam. They were of that Levi tribe. So actually Aaron, in studying where in Leviticus or in Exodus where he brings up Aaron's going to be the one that of his lineage is going to be the priests. Here it talks about the ministry. What I would say the ministry is the Levites, everybody under that family. So the priests are kind of lower level or a little more recent level. It's under Aaron, but all those that are under Levi, and there are several, I think there were 4 brothers, or maybe more than that, under Levi, that was doing the work. And as we mentioned before in our Sunday school lesson and in Wednesday night, the sacrifices where they helped them with the sacrifice was pretty intense as far as it needed a lot of people to go through that. As we talked about, there was approximately maybe 2 million people, we think, as came out of Exodus. And as they go through the desert and through the wilderness of Zin, they of course grow 40 years. They grow. There are more people coming up. Some died off, some come up. So it's a lot of people that once God instituted these sacrifices, they needed a lot of people to help. And when they did that, each one of the tribes, when they went in and got the land, would take over the land, God gave each one of them a parcel of land, except the tribe of Levi. They didn't have a place to raise sheep, raise cattle, or anything. They couldn't raise any money themselves. So this was to take their place. The tithes that they're talking about, that was to be for the Levites for their service. that they did in the temple and in the tabernacle in the early days, and then later on in the temple. So we see Numbers 18 and 21 says, "Behold, I have given the children of Levi all the tithes of Israel as an inheritance in return for their work, which they perform, the work of the tabernacle of the meeting." And some of the things besides the sacrifices they did, every morning and every evening they had a sacrifice. Every morning and every evening they had to change out the bread, the showbread that they had. Every morning and evening they had to light the lamps. They had to change the oil, refill the oil, trim the wick, do all these things. Not every one of them did that, but they had a rotation. You would get your week or so that you would serve, and then through that, that's part of what you served, and then there was an upkeep. After you went through that, you still had to help do other things with the other Levites that they went through. And because of that, this is what was supporting them. And as we've learned in there, the priests, in addition to the Levites getting the 10%, the priests would get, a lot of times, depending on what offering they are giving, they would get the skin of the animal. Okay, whenever they'd make a sacrifice, if it was a cow or sheep or goat, they would get the skin of it, and then they could do whatever they want to with it. They could sell it or use it in their process, making their tents, binding them. That's part of their pay also. That was some of the things that they got. Another time it mentions in Deuteronomy 14, 22, and 23, and this is kind of talking about the tithe. Says, "You shall truly tithe all the increase of your grain that the field produces year by year. And you shall eat before the Lord your God in the place where he chooses to make his name abide, the tithe of your grain and your new wine and your oil of the firstborn of your herds and of your flocks, that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always." This is the time that they're talking about for the convocation, maybe the sacred meetings that they had several times of the year. So they would bring their tithe then to the offering, to the tabernacle. Another tithe was given in the increase every 3 years. Okay? So it says in Deuteronomy 26 and 12, "When you finish laying aside all the tithe of your increase in the 3rd year, the year of tithing, and have given it to the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, so that they may eat within your gates and be filled." So this is not a tenth, it's a tenth, but you hold it for 3 years. So it's really 3 1/3% every year. What does that go for? That's not necessarily for the help of the Levites. That's for the poor, the widows, the fatherless, the strangers, those people like we have. That's what you would call today our welfare system. That goes to help them out. And then there's Deuteronomy 14 and 28 also supports that. It says, "At the end of every 3rd year, you shall bring out the tithe of your produce of that year and store it up within your gates." So it's not something you bring out. It's for, you have to split it off, but it's for the different purposes that they have for this gathering. A couple of other times where they're called offerings or scriptures that are given says there was a half a shekel tax for the service of the tabernacle. Whenever the upkeep, it had to be, early on it was the tabernacle, which was tent. Later on it was the temple. So they had this as a tax. In Exodus 30 and 13, he told Moses, "This is what everyone among those who are numbered shall give. Half a shekel according to the shekel of the sanctuary. A shekel is 20 gerahs. The half shekel shall be an offering to the Lord." So in this particular case, this is still required giving. It may not be a quote, a tithe, but it's somebody where the tithe is a percentage. This is a certain amount, okay, a half a shekel in their case. And they took this up for the tabernacle or the temple to help keep it up. Because sometimes things would, they'd have to, as we go through, and I can't go through all the lesson, but the Levites and the priests, they had certain clothing that they had to wear when they were doing their offering. So they'd come in wearing their other clothing, their world clothing, and come in, they'd wash and clean themselves, put on their clothing to do their duties, and then they'd do their duties, and then they'd come back out, or come back and they'd change again and go back out. So it, part of their clothing, part of the things like that, this is help for the upkeep and keeping the temple going, or the tabernacle. Another commandment was given in Leviticus 23 and 22. Says, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field when you reap, nor shall you gather any gleaning from your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God. So whenever they would go and gather in the season, in the harvesting, told them don't gather the corners, kind of leave some of the produce, whatever it is, wheat, grapes, whatever, leave it for the poor and those that needed it as they'd come by and use it. We see this in the story of Ruth, that she goes out and she's gleaning some of the fields after the guys have already harvested, okay? She goes through and she harvests what she can for her and her mother-in-law to help keep them alive. Boaz takes notice of it, and soon Ruth, that's very poor, becomes the queen, basically, if you want to say that. Boaz is very rich, and he marries her, and so it puts it, when they're doing what God has told them to do, God is blessing them, keeping them up. With all this, of course, we know the scripture in Malachi 3, and I just chose 8 and 10, but the whole thing talks about it's both a blessing and a curse, okay? If you do it, it's good, it's a blessing. If you don't do it, it's a curse. I didn't bring the curse in here, but you can read it. It says, will a man, start at verse 8, will a man rob God? Yet have you robbed me. But you say, in what way have you robbed me? We robbed you. And in tithes and in offerings. Bring all the tithes, verse 10, bring all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. And try me now in this, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open the windows of heaven and pour out for you such blessing that there will not be room enough to receive it. These are the things that it's still emphasizing the sacrificial. Whenever they not only sacrificed animals, they would sacrifice birds, and if you were really poor, all you had to sacrifice or all you could get was grain. So you could bring your grain as an offering to God. They would take their portion of it, the Levite would take the portion of it, and they'd take part of that and burn it, do a burnt offering, and the rest of it they could have for themselves. And then the man, whoever brought it, he could have part of it too. So whatever they took, and it would say a handful. If you got big hands, it's going to take a lot more than little hands. But it just says a handful that they're going to take. But all this is saying God will bless them if you follow these commandments, tithes and offerings. If you don't, you go on a little later and it says there will be a curse upon you if you don't follow it. Many people don't understand that blessing and curse because he can make 90% go further than 100% if you're relying upon God. Seems impossible. The math doesn't work out for us. But for him, he will help us to make it out. Sometimes we have to maybe cinch our belt a little bit or do something different, but he will make it work out for us if we'll abide by him. And then also they had the free will offering. Not a whole lot. There's several scriptures in the Old Testament. I just chose one of them. And it's when they were getting ready for the temple, or the tabernacle. I'm sorry, I keep saying temple, but when they were getting ready for tabernacle, it's a tent, and it had boards, and it needed clothing or linen. It needed some skins for a roof, several layers of skins. It needed some sockets that they made out of gold. Some sockets they made out of silver to join the boards together. They overlaid some of the boards with gold. All this was done, and this was asked by an offering, if you would give to this. In Exodus 36, 5 through 7, it tells us, and they spoke to Moses, saying, the people, and this was the priests or the Levites, the people bring much more than enough for the service of the work which the Lord commanded us to do. So Moses gave a commandment, and they caused it to be proclaimed throughout the camp, saying, let neither man nor woman do any more work for the offering of the sanctuary. And the people were restrained from bringing, for the material they had was sufficient for all the work to be done, indeed, too much. So when they were asked for it, they gave, and they gave. Now, why did they do that? Why were they so giving? Well, when they came out of Egypt, what happened? God told them, as you're leaving Egypt, go to your neighbor and ask them for jewels. You'll be given favor. They went and what they called it is spoiled. You will spoil the Egyptians. And we think of that as like when somebody goes and fights a war and gets that. In this particular case, they had served Egypt for 400 years, more than 400 years, and all they got was nothing, basically, to serve them again. So this was their back pay, is the way I look at it. So God told them, you go and you get, and they did. They spoiled. After all the plagues and everything, the Egyptians were more than willing to give them anything and everything they had to get them out of their country, because their God was so mighty and so strong. They saw it. So all the Israelites, they had all this. They were given it. Now you do have some, like we said before, even in Egyptian times, some that were more well off and some not so well off. But they were all, quote, slaves. Some may have worked in an easier job, and then most of them worked, I'm sure, in the hard labor, making the brick and the clay and all that they needed. But they gave so much, Moses had to say, okay, we don't have a place for it all. This is good enough for it. They had so many boards that they had to get. They had so many skins they had to sew together, so many linens they had to make the curtains, all these different things. You go through Exodus and you read what the temple tabernacle is, and we see that. There's a lot there to it. In the New Testament, this is built upon what Jesus gave them, is built upon the New Testament. Jesus doesn't teach a whole lot about tithes and offerings, okay? But it says, couple of statistics, New Testament has over 500 verses of prayer, where it mentions prayer and faith. How many verses does it mention money or possessions? 2,000. Over 4 times as much in the New Testament. And that's where Jesus kind of hits the nail on the head here in Luke 42:11 and 42. But woe to you, Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and all manner of herbs, and pass by justice and the love of God. These ought to have done without leaving the others undone. Jesus is saying, okay, you're doing good by doing the tithing, but you're missing the point. They would tithe, when they tithed everything, they'd go through their whole house and they'd have a can of whatever, ginger or whatever up here, and they'd give a tenth of that to the, and that's good. That's fine. But they would miss the point. They would leave out the more weightier things. They were going exactly by what the word said. I'm giving them a tenth and nothing more. That's kind of like, whatever I got to do, that's the law. And that's a Pharisaical way of looking at life. I'll do what God tells me to do, and that's it. Now, we want to do what God tells us, but I'm saying when He moves us, wants us to give us more or do things differently, we need to do that. And we didn't go through all this, but here Jesus is reprimanding them more than once, and I'll read another one in just a minute, that because they are missing the point, okay, they may be doing something just as bad as somebody else that they're calling a sinner. But because they're keeping the law, in their mind, they're not looking at this law over here that they're breaking. They're looking at the law. We do that a lot too, if we're not careful. We get very legalistic in it. In the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, the Pharisee was only doing legalistic giving. in what they were giving only what was required. Luke 18:11 and 12. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this tax collector. I fast twice a week, and I give tithes of all that I possess. What's that sin? Pride. He's proud that he gives us. Now, we need to be thankful for God that we can give those things. But the saying is, except for God, there go I. We have to be careful because we could be just like those extortioners, those unjust, those adulterers, if we don't rely upon God and keep in His service the whole time, all these things. And talking about tax collectors, we switch to the other side. When Jesus met Zacchaeus in Luke, he had such an impact upon him. Luke 19:8 through 10 says, Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, Lord, look, if I give half my goods to the poor, and if I had taken anything from anyone by false accusation, I restore him fourfold. And Jesus said to him, Today salvation has come to this house, because he is also a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man is come to seek and to save that which was lost. Tax collectors, when he was watching The Chosen, and it just reemphasizes here, all through, they were usually, especially in Israel, they were Jewish people. But they were working for Rome to get the tax from Rome. How did they make their money? It's not even a percentage. They knew what the tax was on whatever. They would say, okay, so-and-so owns a boat and owns a house, it'd be this much. But I'm the tax collector, so I'm going to collect maybe twice as much, and that'll be my pay. It's not just a percentage like it is today for us. It's whatever I could get out. This guy's got a lot of money. I'm going to tax him like crazy, and I'll get it back. So that's why tax collectors were hated so much. They were working for the Romans, and they were hurting their own people because they would tax them so heavily. Now, Rome did tax them heavily, okay? But whatever they could get above and beyond Rome, that was theirs to keep. This way I understand it. So when Zacchaeus turned around and he said, I'll give half of what I have, and then if I've stolen something from somebody, I'll give them 4 times as much. That's what Jesus recognized in him then. We can't be attached to this world. And Zacchaeus and Matthew and those other tax collectors they had, most of the time they were just doing it because it was a way to get rich, and they were looking out for themselves. But once Zacchaeus and Matthew met the Master, it had a complete change in them, and they were more than willing to give above and beyond what they needed to give. Tithing in the New Testament helps move a Christian to a giving way of life. Once we start that, a lot of times if we're not tithing, and I want to preface this is a lot for the internet, okay? But most everybody does great here. I'm not saying anything about it. But a lot of times in churches, you have a very small percentage that actually tithe. They'll give offerings. I worked with a guy one time, and he was actually, I think, what they would call a deacon in the church. He would take the offerings, I think, once a month. And I don't know, I was young and stupid, I guess. Asked him how much he gave, and he goes, I gave $20 in the offering, and he made a lot more than me, I know. And $20 didn't cover it. I said, you're not giving 10%? He said, 10%? That's crazy. He's like, that's just crazy. And a lot of people, they think that way. Some denominations, it's not obligatory. I mean, it is obligatory. You have to, they come and get you. They want to know your paycheck. So to see if you're paying all you should be paying. But we are to rely upon God, what He tells us to do. And our particular way, we see in Mark, Jesus made this is the closing, Mark 12:41 through 44. When they would take the offering, it's not like we do today or where we do it. It's more like we had it before. They'd set a box back in the back, drill a hole in it, a case that was locked, and that's where the people would put their offering. One day, Jesus sat there by that box and watched people when they come in put their offering in. Well, that'd be something, wouldn't it, to see if Brother Jerry sat back there and let me see what that check is. Okay? Let me see how much you're giving. Let me see all this. Said now Jesus sat opposite the treasury, the box, and saw how the people put money into this treasury. And many who were rich put in much. Then one poor widow came and threw in 2 mites, which makes a quadrant. So he called his disciples to himself and said to them, assuredly I say unto you, that this poor widow has put in more than all those who have given to the treasury. And he said, of a truth, I say unto you, that this poor widow hath cast in more than they all. For all these have of the abundance cast in unto the offerings of God, but she out of her penury hath cast in all the living that she had. Jesus is telling them the others had plenty to give, so they gave. And he's not despiting them. He's just saying she has given more because she don't have anything left. It's kind of like the poor widow with Elisha, I think it was. When he came to her and said, do you have any meal for me? And she goes, well, I got a little bit, a little oil, but we're going to make a couple of pancakes or a couple of pieces of cornbread, and we're going to eat it and we're going to die because that's all we got. And the prophet said, make it for me. Make it for me. And when they did that, they were blessed because the cruse overflowed with oil. It never went out until after the fact. And the flour or the corn, whatever they had at the time, it wouldn't keep. They could just keep using out of it while they were there because they did what the prophet told them. That's what Jesus is telling them. Listen to God, what he's telling us to do. There are some people in this world who can give millions of dollars, and they do, and that's great. But they're listening to God, and I hope. And some of us don't have much. I know most of our church here is retired or getting ready to retire or whatever, and we're kind of on fixed income. So we're given what we can, and that's what God wants. And sometimes we have things that come up, and it's just, I'm like Brother Epperson, I'm amazed at how this church gives when something happens. When something over here, the furnace goes out, or the air conditioner, or the roof needs fixing, and the Lord's blessed us, we have some funds in reserve, yes, to use for that, but most of the time we don't because the church gives for it, and it gives more and more. And we as stewards of the church, we need to look at what we're giving, and that's why we give to missionaries and other things as a church, because we want to use that money the way God has given it to us. We can hoard it here ourselves, and get whatever we want, but we need to reach out through the love of God through all these things that we give. And so hopefully you've learned a little bit about this, about biblical giving. There's many, many more scriptures I didn't even touch on.